deep within Colombia's sacred highlands, where crystalline lakes hold secrets older than memory and golden mists dance between towering peaks. One of history's most extraordinary civilizations built an empire that would captivate the world's imagination. The Muisca people transformed these blessed mountains into realms of prosperity and power, creating confederations that commanded respect across vast territories through mastery of astronomy, metallurgy, and divine statecraft. Yet their greatest achievement lay not in conquering neighboring peoples, but in perfecting ceremonies that bridged heaven and earth. At Lake Guatavita's sacred waters, their kings underwent transformations so profound that Spanish conquistadors would spend centuries chasing the legend born from these rituals, El Dorado, the Golden One. This is the story of how sophisticated theologians and brilliant engineers created a civilization whose spiritual sophistication would survive conquest, whose legends would outlast empire, and whose golden ceremonies would echo through history long after the last Muisca king fell silent beneath foreign steel. High above the emerald valleys of the Altiplano Cundiboyacense, where morning mists rise from sacred lakes like prayers ascending to heaven, the peaks of Colombia's eastern Cordillera thrust skyward like the backbone of creation itself. Here, in this realm, where condors soar between summits crowned with eternal clouds, where ancient waters carve gorges deep as divine wounds through granite and limestone, the stage awaits the arrival of peoples who will transform these blessed highlands into the heartland of a confederation whose influence spans continents. The geography of this elevated paradise speaks of divine favor through every stone and stream that flows from cloud-wrapped peaks toward valleys where the earth runs black and rich as melted night. Fertile valleys nestle between protective ridges, while sacred lakes mirror the sky like crystal windows opening onto heaven itself. High plateaus stretch between mountain ranges where deer leap through morning mists and jaguars prowl through evening shadows, their surfaces broken by streams that cascade down rocky faces in waterfalls that catch sunlight like falling silver. While distant peoples depend upon rivers that may run dry, or rains that may fail to come, these uplands drink from clouds that gather like divine offerings around holy peaks throughout the year. Rainfall that arrives with seasonal certainty fills natural reservoirs carved into cliff tops by geological forces older than human memory, their waters flowing through underground channels that feed springs emerging from mountainsides like gifts from earth spirits dwelling in stone hearts. Early settlement patterns that develop across these highlands reflect both environmental opportunities and spiritual relationships that bind human communities to natural features whose power transcends mere geographical convenience. The first hunters and gatherers who arrive in these territories, around 10,000 years before the Common Era, discover landscapes that provide everything necessary for human survival, while demanding careful attention to seasonal rhythms and ecological relationships that govern all life in these elevated domains. By 1500 BC, these scattered bands have transformed into agricultural communities, whose settled existence enables population growth and technological development that gradually reshapes highland environments according to human needs, while respecting natural limits that ensure long-term sustainability. Families that once followed game trails now establish permanent villages beside streams, whose dependable flow supports expanding populations through seasonal variations that once required constant movement in search of adequate resources. Complex societies that emerge from agricultural abundance develop specialized roles that enable remarkable achievements in ceramics, astronomy, and metallurgy that distinguish highland communities from their lowland neighbors. Early temples that rise on natural hillocks and artificial mounds provide focal points for ceremonies that coordinate community activities with celestial cycles observed by priest astronomers, whose knowledge becomes essential for agricultural timing and social organization. Astronomical observation platforms that crown these early temples enable systematic tracking of solar and lunar movements across yearly cycles, their stone circles and aligned markers creating calendars that integrate practical agricultural needs with spiritual obligations that acknowledge the divine forces governing natural phenomena. Priests who master these complex calculations achieve social status that reflects both their practical value and their role as intermediaries between human communities and supernatural powers. The Chibchan language family that develops throughout highland territories creates linguistic unity that facilitates communication and cultural exchange between communities, separated by mountain ranges and river valleys. This shared language enables the preservation and transmission of accumulated knowledge about agriculture, astronomy, and ceremonial practices, while creating frameworks for political cooperation that transcend local boundaries and kinship networks. Chibchan speakers who populate highland valleys maintain cultural connections with Tairona peoples along Caribbean coasts and other Andean groups whose languages reflect common origins in linguistic traditions that spread throughout northern South America during prehistoric migrations. These connections enable exchange relationships that bring marine products to highland settlements while carrying mountain goods to coastal markets, creating networks that span ecological zones from tropical beaches to alpine meadows. Maize-based agriculture that transforms highland food production enables population densities that support craft specialization and complex social organization, while maintaining ecological balance through farming techniques adapted specifically to mountain environments. Traditional cultivation methods that develop through generations of experimentation create sustainable agricultural systems capable of feeding growing populations without depleting soil fertility or exhausting water resources. Salt extraction that begins with seasonal gathering from natural deposits evolves into systematic mining operations that provide highland communities with trade goods valuable enough to purchase exotic products from distant regions. Underground chambers where crystalline formations accumulate through geological processes become workshops where workers extract white blocks whose purity and flavor command premium prices in markets throughout the known territories. Coca cultivation that adapts wild plants to agricultural production provides highland communities with stimulants that enhance physical endurance while serving ceremonial purposes that connect users with spiritual forces governing natural phenomena. Traditional knowledge about proper growing conditions, harvest timing, and preparation techniques creates specialized agricultural sectors whose products serve both domestic consumption and regional exchange networks. Development of metallurgy begins when highland communities gain access to copper through trade relationships with regions where surface deposits provide native metals that can be worked without complex smelting techniques. Early metal workers who learn to shape these materials into tools and ornaments gradually develop skills that enable more sophisticated techniques for extracting and processing metallic ores found in highland geological formations. Bronze, working that emerges from copper technology, enables production of superior tools and weapons that give highland communities advantages over neighbors who lack access to metal resources or technical knowledge required for alloy production. Master smiths who achieve reputations for excellence become valued community members whose workshops serve as centers for technological innovation and artistic development. The mythic origins that provide spiritual foundations for highland culture center on Bochica, the bearded civilizing god whose arrival in primordial times brings knowledge of agriculture, metallurgy, and social organization to peoples who previously lived in primitive conditions. Legends that recount his teachings emphasize the divine origins of technological and social innovations that distinguish highland communities from less sophisticated neighbors, while establishing moral principles that govern proper behavior. Chia, the moon goddess, whose silver radiance illuminates highland valleys during nocturnal hours, governs feminine cycles and agricultural timing, while providing spiritual protection for travelers who must cross dangerous mountain passes during darkness. Her relationship with solar deities creates cosmic frameworks that organize ceremonial calendars and agricultural activities according to celestial rhythms that reflect divine will operating through natural phenomena. Foundations of Highland cosmology that develop around these divine figures create sophisticated theological systems that integrate practical knowledge about natural phenomena with spiritual understanding of supernatural forces governing earthly existence, dualities that structure cosmic relationships, light and darkness, male and female, sky and earth, provide organizing principles for social organization and ceremonial activities that maintain harmony between human communities and divine powers. Temples that house these developing religious traditions begin as simple structures built on natural elevations that provide visibility and acoustic properties suitable for ceremonies involving entire communities. Stone construction techniques that develop for these sacred buildings gradually influence domestic architecture, while creating monuments that demonstrate community prosperity and spiritual dedication to observers who witness their impressive scale and artistic sophistication. Sacred sites that emerge throughout Highland territories reflect both natural features that possess inherent spiritual significance and constructed spaces that focus community attention on particular deities or ceremonial functions. Mountain peaks that house spirits, springs that provide access to underground realms, and caves that penetrate Earth's depths become pilgrimage destinations that attract visitors from distant settlements while serving local communities' spiritual needs. Ceramic production that develops alongside agricultural expansion enables storage of surplus food while providing vessels for cooking and serving that enhance both nutritional value and social significance of communal meals. Artistic traditions that emerge in pottery decoration create visual languages that encode cultural values and spiritual concepts while demonstrating technical skills that command respect from communities throughout Highland regions. Textile production that begins with processing plant fibers evolves into sophisticated industries that create clothing suitable for Highland climates, while producing decorative fabrics that serve ceremonial purposes. Traditional knowledge about fiber preparation, dyeing techniques, and weaving methods accumulates through generations of specialized practice, creating artistic traditions that preserve cultural identity while adapting to changing social needs. Astronomical knowledge that accumulates through systematic observation of celestial phenomena enables Highland communities to develop calendars that coordinate agricultural activities with seasonal variations, while providing frameworks for ceremonial cycles that acknowledge divine influence over earthly affairs. Priest astronomers who master these complex calculations achieve social status that reflects their essential role in community welfare and spiritual guidance. Stone circles that mark astronomical alignments begin appearing throughout Highland territories during this period, their precise positioning reflecting mathematical knowledge and engineering capabilities that enable accurate prediction of seasonal changes and celestial events. These megalithic monuments require coordinated community labor and technical expertise that demonstrate both material prosperity and intellectual sophistication. Religious practices that emerge from Highland environmental experience create ceremonial traditions perfectly adapted to mountain conditions, while incorporating theological concepts that reflect sophisticated understanding of relationships between natural phenomena and divine forces. Seasonal festivals that celebrate agricultural cycles, pilgrimage routes that connect sacred sites, and initiation ceremonies that mark life transitions create rich spiritual lives that provide meaning and purpose for growing communities. Trade networks that develop around salt extraction gradually expand to include other highland products, while bringing exotic goods from distant regions into mountain territories. Merchants who specialize in long-distance commerce create relationships that span ecological zones and cultural boundaries, their activities generating wealth that supports craft specialization and social complexity while exposing highland communities to foreign ideas and technologies. Emerald deposits that exist within highland territories remain largely unexploited during this early period, though occasional discoveries of greenstones in stream beds provide materials for ceremonial objects that demonstrate divine favor, while creating trade goods valued by distant communities. Traditional knowledge about geological formations that contain precious stones accumulates gradually through generations of environmental observation and practical experience. Population growth that results from agricultural abundance creates pressure for territorial expansion, while generating social complexity that requires new forms of organization capable of coordinating activities across larger geographical areas and more diverse communities. Villages that once operated as independent units begin forming alliances that enable mutual support during emergencies, while facilitating resource sharing and coordinated defense against external threats. Military capabilities that develop in response to territorial competition enable highland communities to project force beyond immediate neighborhood boundaries, while defending valuable resources from raiders who seek to capture rather than develop sources of wealth. Weapons technology that advances through conflict experience creates advantages that favor communities with superior metallurgy and tactical organization over neighbors who lack these capabilities. Social stratification that reflects both individual achievement and hereditary status begins emerging as communities grow large enough to support specialized roles, while maintaining agricultural productivity sufficient to feed non-farming populations. Successful farmers, skilled artisans, accomplished warriors, and knowledgeable priests achieve elevated status that enables their families to maintain advantageous positions across generations while accepting obligations to serve community welfare. Cultural achievements that emerge from this period of development include artistic traditions, architectural innovations, and intellectual accomplishments that distinguish highland societies from their neighbors, while creating foundations for even greater achievements during subsequent periods. Epic poetry that preserves historical memory, musical compositions that accompany ceremonies, and visual arts that adorn sacred buildings demonstrate cultural sophistication that rivals contemporary civilizations throughout the Andean region. By the close of this formative period, highland communities have established technological, economic, social, and spiritual foundations, sophisticated enough to support the complex political developments that will transform scattered village settlements into confederations commanding respect throughout known territories. Agricultural abundance flowing from terraced fields provides surplus needed to support specialist roles, while mineral wealth creates networks connecting mountain communities with distant regions. Population growth, driven by abundance, creates pressure for territorial expansion, leading to competition between growing settlements for control over productive lands and valuable resources. Networks bringing prosperity also create vulnerabilities, requiring defensive organization, while religious sites attracting pilgrims from distant villages become focal points for activities transcending local boundaries. These foundations, established through patient development across generations, provide resources necessary to support evolution that will unite mountain valleys under common governance while preserving cultural achievements, distinguishing mountain peoples from lowland neighbors. The stage stands prepared for emergence of leaders whose vision encompasses possibilities surrounding them, rulers ready to transform scattered settlements into confederations, whose influence extends across territories, spanning from snow-crowned peaks to valleys where great rivers begin journeys towards distant seas. Across the fertile valleys where terraced fields climb toward cloud-wrapped peaks, the Muisca settlements that once struggled for mere survival now face the pleasant burden of abundance. Surplus grain fills storage chambers carved into cliffsides, while mineral wealth flows like golden streams along ancient paths, connecting mountain villages to distant shores. Yet prosperity brings its own challenges, as growing populations press against territorial boundaries, and competition intensifies for the most productive valleys. Between groups whose ancestors once shared Bachuay's teachings in peaceful harmony. Population growth, driven by agricultural success, creates pressure that transforms the highland landscape in ways the First Mother never envisioned. Families multiply faster than new farmland can be cleared from mountainsides, while successful communities attract migrants from less fortunate settlements seeking opportunities unavailable in their birth territories. Villages that once housed 50 souls suddenly find themselves supporting hundreds, straining resources and social structures designed for smaller, more intimate groups, where everyone knew their neighbors' names and family histories. Competition for territory that begins with polite negotiations between neighboring chiefs gradually escalates into armed conflicts as diplomatic solutions fail to satisfy growing communities' needs for expansion. Raids that start as disputes over boundary markers evolve into organized campaigns designed to seize the most productive valleys, the richest salt deposits, the most strategic mountain passes, controlling access to valuable resources. Success in these conflicts depends increasingly on military organization, rather than individual warrior prowess or traditional leadership based on spiritual authority alone. In the southern reaches of the Plateau, where Laca Guatavita reflects morning's sun like a mirror polished by divine hands, ambitious leaders begin consolidating smaller settlements under their protection and authority. The Zipper, whose title speaks of leadership blessed by celestial powers, establishes dominion over territories centered on the emerging settlement of Bakatar. This strategic location commands valleys so fertile they produce harvests abundant enough to support professional warriors, whose only duty involves protecting trade routes and enforcing territorial claims against rival groups seeking to expand their own domains. Bakatar's development into a true administrative center reflects sophisticated understanding of both defensive requirements and commercial opportunities that emerge from controlling strategic transportation routes. Natural features that provide defensive advantages combine with constructed fortifications that enable relatively small garrison forces to control access to extensive agricultural territories and valuable resource extraction sites. The settlement's position at the intersection of highland paths and lowland routes enables its rulers to tax commerce flowing between mountain producers and coastal markets, while demonstrating military capabilities that discourage challenges to their growing authority. Palace compounds that emerge within Bakatar demonstrate architectural sophistication that rivals contemporary achievements throughout the Andean region, while creating administrative centers capable of coordinating activities across territories that span multiple ecological zones. Stone construction techniques that developed through temple building projects adapt to serve secular purposes. They're massive blocks fitted with precision that enables construction of multi-story buildings whose upper levels provide commanding views over surrounding landscapes, while lower chambers house administrative offices and storage facilities. Ceremonial spaces within these palace complexes serve dual functions that blend governmental activities with religious obligations that legitimate political authority through divine sanction. Courtyards where public assemblies occur during daylight hours transform into sacred precincts for nighttime ceremonies that maintain spiritual relationships between earthly rulers and supernatural powers governing natural phenomena. Astronomical alignments that orient major buildings enable coordination of administrative activities, with ceremonial calendars that structure both secular and religious aspects of Confederation governance. Meanwhile, in the northern highlands, where peaks thrust even closer to the realm of the gods, similar consolidation occurs around the mountain stronghold that becomes known as Hunza. The Zark, whose authority derives from control over emerald mines at Muzo and Chivor, understands that commanding the flow of precious green stones provides leverage over neighbors who depend upon these treasures to purchase goods unavailable in their own territories, while establishing diplomatic relationships with distant peoples who value highland products. Northern consolidation follows patterns different from southern development, reflecting unique challenges and opportunities presented by the highland environment, where defensive considerations often outweigh commercial advantages. Emerald extraction requires specialized knowledge and careful management to maintain production while preventing unauthorized mining by competitors or enemies who might gain access to deposits through territorial conquest or diplomatic alliance with disaffected local populations. Hunza's evolution into a fortified administrative center emphasizes defensive strength over commercial convenience, its position atop mountain ridges providing natural fortification that enemy forces find nearly impossible to assault successfully. Underground passages that connect different sections of the settlement enable defenders to move reinforcements and supplies without exposure to enemy observation, while hidden entrances that emerge in unexpected locations allow surprise attacks against besieging forces that assume they have achieved complete encirclement. The organization into two major confederations that emerges from this competitive consolidation reflects both geographic realities and cultural preferences shaped by generations of adaptation to different environmental conditions. Southern territories centered on Bakatar benefit from lower elevations and warmer climates that support diverse agricultural production, while northern lands around Hunza excel in mineral extraction and specialized crafts requiring the cooler temperatures and clearer air found at higher altitudes. Trade relationships that develop between these confederations create economic interdependence that serves both competitive and cooperative functions, enabling each region to specialize in products where they possess natural advantages while maintaining access to goods produced more efficiently elsewhere. Southern agricultural surplus flows northward to support mining communities whose specialized activities prevent them from achieving food self-sufficiency, while northern emeralds travel southward to enhance the prestige and diplomatic capabilities of political leaders who use these precious stones to establish relationships with distant peoples. Rule by semi-divine kings who combine political authority with religious responsibility creates governmental systems unlike anything seen among peoples who separate secular and spiritual power into distinct institutional frameworks. The Zipper and Zarg serve not merely as military commanders and administrative coordinators, but as intermediaries between human communities and supernatural forces governing natural phenomena. whose favorable disposition determines community prosperity and survival. Royal investiture ceremonies that legitimate political authority through divine sanction require elaborate rituals that demonstrate supernatural approval, while creating public spectacles that inspire both loyalty and fear among subject populations. Sacred regalia that transforms mortal individuals into divine representatives includes golden ornaments whose spiritual significance transcends their material value. Ceremonial weapons that symbolize divine authority rather than human violence, and astronomical instruments that enable coordination of governmental activities with celestial cycles. Divine kingship concepts that legitimize Confederation rule incorporate both indigenous traditions derived from Highland cosmology and innovative elements that adapt ancient theological frameworks to contemporary political requirements. Royal authority that derives from spiritual as well as secular sources enables monarchs to command obedience based on religious conviction rather than mere fear of punishment, creating governmental systems whose stability depends upon maintaining proper relationships with supernatural forces that validate earthly power. Secondary chiefs, known as caciques, who govern local territories under royal oversight, create decentralized systems balancing central authority with regional autonomy that reflects practical necessities of governing extensive territories with limited communication capabilities. These local leaders maintain intimate knowledge of their particular domains, while acknowledging allegiance to Confederation rulers, whose broader perspective enables coordination of activities across larger territories, spanning multiple ecological zones and cultural traditions. Cacique appointment processes that combine hereditary succession with royal confirmation ensure both continuity of local governance and central control over regional administration. Local noble families that trace descent from early settlement leaders maintain claims to governing positions while accepting royal authority to approve or reject particular candidates based on demonstrated competence and political reliability. Tribute obligations that bind local territories to central authority through systematic resource transfers create economic relationships that enable Confederation rulers to maintain professional military forces and administrative bureaucracies, while providing regional communities with protection and coordination services that enhance their prosperity and security. Traditional patterns of reciprocal obligation that once governed relationships between kinship groups adapt to serve larger political structures that span cultural and linguistic boundaries. Capital cities that emerge at Bakatar and Hunza demonstrate urban planning sophistication that reflects both defensive requirements and commercial opportunities, while creating population centers capable of supporting craft specialization and cultural complexity previously impossible in smaller settlements. Residential districts that house different social classes reflect status distinctions while maintaining neighborhood organization that preserves community solidarity and mutual support networks. Market squares where goods from throughout Confederation territories change hands create economic networks that bind distant regions together through commercial relationships that transcend political boundaries and cultural differences. Merchant quarters that house traders from foreign territories enable diplomatic as well as commercial exchanges that expand Confederation influence while providing access to exotic goods and foreign technologies that enhance local prosperity and cultural sophistication. Sacred precincts within both capitals separate religious activities from secular business, while maintaining spiritual foundations that legitimate political authority and provide frameworks for community ceremonies that reinforce social solidarity. Temples dedicated to major deities rise alongside administrative buildings, their ceremonies coordinated with governmental activities to demonstrate divine sanction underlying royal power, while providing spiritual services that enhance community welfare and cultural identity. Social structure that develops within both confederations maintains principles preventing emergence of true slavery, while acknowledging differences in status, wealth, and responsibility that reflect individual achievements and family heritage. Nobles who trace descent from early leaders and successful warriors enjoy privileges that include exemption from certain tribute obligations and preferential treatment in legal disputes. But these advantages come with corresponding responsibilities for military service and community welfare that justify their elevated positions. Warriors who distinguish themselves in battle can achieve elevated status regardless of birth circumstances, while artisans whose skills produce goods valued throughout Confederation territories earn respect and prosperity that enables their children to pursue education and careers unavailable to ordinary farmers. This social mobility based on merit rather than inherited position creates incentives for excellence while preventing rigid class divisions that might undermine Confederation unity. Craft specialization that emerges from economic prosperity enables artisans to achieve levels of excellence impossible when they must divide time between artistic production and subsistence farming. Metalworkers who master advanced techniques for creating bronze implements and tumbaga ornaments achieve reputations that extend far beyond Confederation boundaries. Their pieces sought by foreign rulers who prize Highland craftsmanship for both aesthetic and diplomatic purposes. Textile production that develops sophisticated techniques for creating patterned fabrics establishes artistic traditions that serve both practical and ceremonial purposes, while creating trade goods valued throughout regional commercial networks. Master weavers who achieve reputations for superior quality receive commissions from noble families and religious institutions, whose requirements for ceremonial garments drive innovation in dyeing techniques and pattern creation. Pottery making that advances beyond simple utilitarian vessels creates artistic traditions that serve ceremonial purposes, while demonstrating technical sophistication that commands respect from foreign visitors who recognize Highland achievements in ceramic arts. Specialized workshops that focus entirely on luxury pottery production create pieces whose quality exceeds anything produced by part-time craftsmen, while establishing artistic styles that influence cultural development throughout Confederation territories. Commoners who form the agricultural foundation, supporting both confederations, enjoy security and prosperity unknown to their ancestors, while accepting obligations for tribute payment and military service that ensure continued protection and community welfare. Farmers whose terraced fields produce surplus grain share portions of their harvests with specialists whose skills benefit everyone, while receiving assistance during emergencies and access to manufactured goods that improve their productivity and quality of life. Agricultural innovation that continues throughout this period adapts traditional farming techniques to serve larger populations, while maintaining environmental sustainability that enables long-term prosperity. New crop varieties that mature more quickly or resist disease provide security against harvest failures, while improved storage techniques enable communities to maintain food reserves sufficient to survive periodic shortages that might otherwise cause famine and social disruption. Economic prowess that flows from Confederation organization transforms Highland territories from subsistence regions into commercial powers capable of influencing developments throughout known territories. Control of salt mines enables both confederations to negotiate from positions of strength with peoples who depend upon Highland minerals for food preservation, while emerald wealth creates diplomatic opportunities with distant rulers who value these precious stones for ceremonial and decorative purposes. Military organization that serves Confederation defense requirements, coordinates regional forces under unified command, while preserving distinctive fighting traditions that give different territorial units their particular strengths. Highland warriors, whose mountain training makes them nearly invincible in rough terrain, cooperate with lowland fighters who excel in open field combat, creating combined forces that can adapt their tactics to any environment while maintaining numerical advantages over less organized opponents. Weapons development that supports military integration produces standardized equipment that enables different units to fight effectively together, while maintaining quality standards that ensure battlefield superiority over enemies who lack Confederation resources. Bronze working techniques that create reliable, durable weapons enable mass production that equips large armies while freeing individual fighters from necessity of crafting their own equipment. Intelligence networks that support military and political decision-making gather information about potential threats and opportunities throughout the region while maintaining security around Confederation plans and capabilities. Merchants who travel extensively provide valuable intelligence about conditions in distant territories, while diplomatic contacts with foreign rulers yield insights into political developments that might affect Confederation interests. The Confederation's system that emerges from this period of consolidation and expansion creates political entities sophisticated enough to coordinate activities across territories spanning multiple ecological zones while maintaining internal cohesion, despite ethnic and linguistic diversity within their borders. Administrative innovations that enable effective governance of complex societies, military organizations capable of defending Confederation interests against external threats, and economic systems generating wealth sufficient to support ambitious construction projects and elaborate ceremonial activities establish foundations for achievements that will make Highland Confederations legendary throughout the known world. Population growth that created pressure for territorial expansion has been channeled into political organization, managing resources efficiently while providing security and prosperity for constituent populations. Technological advances that emerged from craft specialization now serve Confederation-wide purposes while maintaining innovation that keeps society ahead of less organized neighbors. The stage stands prepared for religious and ceremonial elaboration that will crown these political achievements with spiritual authority, commanding respect from supernatural as well as earthly powers. In the deepest hours before dawn, when Chia's silver light bathes the sacred waters of Lake Guatavita, and no wind disturbs the perfect mirror, reflecting star patterns older than human memory, preparation begins for the ceremony that will transform mortal flesh into divine vessel. The zipper stands naked beside waters that hold the accumulated offerings of generations, his body trembling not from highland cold, but from the awesome responsibility of becoming the Golden One, El Dorado, the gilded man whose transformation bridges the chasm between earthly power and celestial authority. Priests who have spent years mastering the intricate requirements of this most sacred ritual move through the darkness with practiced precision, their chanted prayers carrying across water so still it seems like polished obsidian. These servants of the divine pantheon understand that tonight's ceremony represents more than political pageantry. It embodies the fundamental relationship between human communities and the supernatural forces governing mountain storms, seasonal rains, agricultural abundance, and the very continuation of life itself in these elevated territories. The pantheon that watches over this sacred transformation has evolved through generations of theological development, incorporating deities whose origins stretch back to Bashue's first teachings while embracing spiritual innovations that reflect the Confederation's growing sophistication and territorial expansion. Sue, the sun god whose daily journey across highland skies provides the fundamental rhythm structuring all earthly activities, commands primary reverence as the source of light, warmth, and agricultural growth essential for community survival. Divine solar attributes that distinguish Sue from other celestial deities include his role as timekeeper, whose movements regulate all human activities, agricultural guardian whose rays ripen crops and dry harvests, and cosmic ruler whose authority transcends earthly political boundaries. Golden ornaments that represent solar power serve ceremonial functions that connect earthly rulers with celestial authority, their radiance reflecting divine light, while transforming mortal leaders into supernatural representatives whose commands carry divine sanction. Chia, the moon goddess, whose silver radiance illuminates sacred ceremonies and nocturnal activities, governs the tidal forces affecting women's cycles, agricultural timing, and the mysterious processes of transformation that occur during darkness. Her relationship with Sue creates the eternal dance of light and shadow, day and night, growth and rest, that provides the cosmic framework within which human communities organize their activities according to celestial rhythms that reflect divine will, operating through natural phenomena. Lunar ceremonies that honor Chia's monthly transformations coordinate with agricultural activities that depend upon nocturnal influences affecting plant growth and soil moisture, while feminine rituals that acknowledge her authority over reproductive cycles create spiritual frameworks for managing family relationships and community demographics. Silver ornaments that channel lunar power serve ceremonial purposes, complementing solar regalia, their cool radiance providing balance for golden accessories that might otherwise overwhelm mortal wearers with excessive divine energy. Bochica, the bearded civilizer god whose arrival in primordial times brought the knowledge of agriculture, metallurgy, and social organization to primitive peoples, receives special veneration as the divine teacher whose gifts enabled the transformation from barbarism to civilization. His legends speak of miraculous interventions that saved ancient populations from floods, droughts, and other catastrophes, while establishing the moral principles governing proper behavior between individuals and communities. Sacred narratives that preserve Bochica's teachings emphasize divine origins of technological and social innovations that distinguish highland communities from less sophisticated neighbors, while providing theological justification for Confederation political systems that claim legitimacy through supernatural sanction. Ceremonial objects that represent his authority include staffs carved with astronomical symbols, golden ornaments that combine solar and lunar imagery, and architectural elements that align temples with celestial phenomena associated with his legendary appearances. Huitasha, the rebellious goddess whose beauty and wisdom challenge conventional social arrangements, represents the creative chaos necessary for growth and change, while embodying the dangerous attractions that can lead communities away from traditional values toward innovation and transformation. Her stories teach important lessons about balancing respect for ancestral wisdom with openness to beneficial changes that circumstances may require, while warning against excessive deviation from established customs that maintain social harmony. Theological concepts that develop around Whitaker's complex character reflect sophisticated understanding of social dynamics that require both stability and flexibility to maintain community welfare across changing circumstances. Ceremonial activities that acknowledge her influence include festivals that temporarily reverse normal social hierarchies, artistic expressions that explore themes of rebellion and transformation, and educational practices that encourage critical thinking while maintaining respect for traditional authority. Chibchachum, the powerful deity who controls earthquakes and underground forces, governs the geological processes that shape mountain landscapes, while threatening destruction to communities that fail to maintain proper relationships with spiritual powers. His anger can split mountains, drain lakes, or bury settlements under landslides, while his benevolence ensures the stability that enables construction of temples, cities, and the infrastructure supporting Confederation prosperity. Geological ceremonies that honor Chibchachum's authority include rituals performed before major construction projects, offerings placed in caves and underground chambers that provide access to his domain, and emergency observances conducted during earthquakes or landslides that demonstrate his displeasure with human behavior. Mining activities that disturb underground realms require special permissions obtained through elaborate ceremonies that acknowledge his sovereignty over subterranean treasures. The sacred geography that provides settings for religious activities reflects sophisticated understanding of natural phenomena, combined with theological interpretations that transform landscape features into manifestations of divine power. Lake Guatavita's perfectly circular form, created by volcanic forces operating beyond human control, demonstrates supernatural intervention in shaping highland topography according to divine plans that mortal minds can barely comprehend. This sacred lake's geological formation occurred when underground fires erupted through Earth's surface, creating a crater whose walls contain waters so pure they seem like liquid crystal blessed by celestial powers. The circular shape that results from this volcanic activity provides the perfect amphitheater for ceremonies, requiring acoustic properties that amplify prayers and chants, while creating resonances that connect earthly voices with divine listeners dwelling in distant realms. Acoustic properties that make Guatavita ideal for ceremonial purposes include natural amplification that carries whispered prayers across entire water surfaces, echo patterns that create mystical sound effects during chanted rituals, and resonance frequencies that induce altered states of consciousness in participants who achieve spiritual communion with supernatural forces. These natural features combine with artificial enhancements that include stone platforms positioned for optimal sound projection and underwater formations that modify acoustic characteristics according to water levels and seasonal variations. Iguaque, that pristine lake where Bachué first emerged with her infant companion, maintains its status as the most sacred pilgrimage destination throughout Confederation territories. Believers who undertake difficult journeys to reach these holy waters seek spiritual renewal, healing from physical ailments, and divine guidance for important life decisions. The rituals performed at Iguaque's shores connect contemporary worshippers with the primordial moment when divine and human realms first intersected. Pilgrimage routes that lead to Iguaque create networks of sacred geography that connect distant communities through shared spiritual experiences, while establishing territorial markers that define Confederation boundaries according to religious rather than purely political considerations. Sacred sites that mark stages along these pilgrimage paths include springs where travelers perform purification rituals, caves where overnight vigils prepare pilgrims for final approaches to holy destinations, and mountain peaks where astronomical observations coordinate ceremonial timing with celestial phenomena. Tota's vast expanse, stretching across highland plateaus like an inland sea, provides settings for ceremonial activities requiring larger spaces and different acoustic properties than those available at smaller lakes. The seasonal variations in water levels that occur at Tota enable priests to time specific rituals according to natural cycles, while demonstrating the intimate connections between celestial movements and terrestrial phenomena. that validate theological claims about divine control over earthly events. Ceremonial platforms that emerge from Tota's waters during dry seasons become temporary temples for rituals that can only be performed when participants achieve physical proximity to supernatural forces dwelling beneath lake surfaces. These underwater structures, constructed during low water periods and designed to withstand submersion during high water seasons, demonstrate engineering capabilities that serve religious rather than secular purposes, while creating architectural achievements that rival contemporary accomplishments throughout the Andean region. Siecha's 3 connected lakes create natural temples whose unusual formation enables complex ceremonial sequences involving movement between different sacred spaces during extended rituals that may continue for days or weeks. The underground channels linking these waters symbolize hidden connections between visible and invisible realms, while providing practical advantages for ceremonies, requiring acoustic effects that enhance spiritual experiences through sound transmission between separated performance areas. Ritual sequences that utilize Siecha's unique geography include initiation ceremonies that mark transitions between different life stages, seasonal observances that coordinate multiple communities' activities across Confederation territories, and diplomatic rituals that establish relationships between political entities through shared participation in religious activities that transcend secular boundaries. These complex ceremonies require coordination between numerous priests and extensive preparation that involves entire communities in supporting activities. Tumbaga metallurgy that reaches unprecedented sophistication during this period enables creation of ceremonial objects whose beauty and spiritual significance surpass anything achieved by earlier craftsmen. The precise proportions of gold and copper required to produce alloys that glow with divine light, while maintaining workability, demand mathematical knowledge and technical skills that approach the supernatural in their precision and consistency. Metallurgical workshops that specialize in tumbaga production become centers of both technical innovation and spiritual activity, their master craftsmen undergoing religious preparation that transforms secular craftsmanship into sacred vocation. Furnaces that melt precious metals receive ritual blessing before each use, while tools employed in casting and finishing achieve sacred status through ceremonial consecration that acknowledges divine participation in creative processes. Master metal workers who achieve reputation for excellence in tumbaga production undergo spiritual preparation that transforms their craft into sacred activity, blessed by divine powers. These artisans fast for prescribed periods before beginning important projects, perform purification rituals that cleanse their workshops of negative influences, and invoke spiritual guidance that ensures their technical skills serve religious rather than merely aesthetic purposes. Alloy formulations that produce desired colors and working properties require knowledge that combines practical metallurgy with spiritual understanding of relationships between different metals and their associated divine powers. Gold that channels solar energy must be balanced with copper that provides structural stability, while silver additions that invoke lunar influences create alloys suitable for ceremonies honoring Chia rather than Sue. These technical decisions reflect theological as well as practical considerations. Lost wax casting techniques that enable reproduction of intricate forms begin with models carved from materials that burn away completely when molten metal fills prepared molds. The precision required to create these original forms demands artistic skills combined with technical knowledge that few individuals possess, making master craftsmen whose work achieves higher standards valued members of Confederation society, whose services command respect and substantial compensation. Workshop organization that supports sophisticated metallurgy includes specialized roles for different aspects of production processes, from initial design and model creation through final finishing and ceremonial consecration. Apprenticeship programs that transmit technical knowledge also provide spiritual education that enables students to understand religious significance of their craft, while developing skills necessary for independent practice. Tunjos, those miniature golden figures that serve as votive offerings in lakeside ceremonies, represent one of the most sophisticated achievements of Highland religious art. Each tiny sculpture captures specific gestures, clothing details, and ceremonial implements that encode prayers and petitions directed toward particular deities or spiritual purposes. The accumulated knowledge required to create figures that effectively communicate with divine powers passes from master craftsmen to carefully selected apprentices through intensive training programs lasting many years. Different tunjo forms serve distinct ceremonial purposes, their specific designs determined by theological requirements rather than artistic preferences. Figures depicting individuals with arms raised skyward carry prayers for favorable weather, agricultural abundance, or protection from natural disasters. Sculptures showing multiple figures arranged in ceremonial formations commemorate important events while requesting divine blessing for similar future occasions. Iconographic systems that govern tunjo design encode complex theological concepts through visual elements that trained priests can interpret, while remaining comprehensible to lay worshippers who participate in offering ceremonies. Clothing styles that indicate social status, gesture patterns that convey specific spiritual meanings, and accessory details that reference particular deities create visual languages that serve educational as well as devotional functions. Manufacturing techniques that enable mass production of tunjos while maintaining artistic quality include standardized molds for common figure types, specialized tools for adding individual details, and quality control procedures that ensure spiritual as well as aesthetic standards. Workshop systems that coordinate production schedules with ceremonial calendars enable timely completion of custom pieces, while maintaining inventories of standard offerings suitable for spontaneous religious activities. Ceremonial objects beyond tunjos demonstrate the theological sophistication that characterizes mature Confederation religious practice. Golden masks that transform wearers into divine representatives, ornamental vessels that hold offerings during sacred rituals, ceremonial weapons that symbolize divine authority rather than human violence. Each category of religious artwork serves specific purposes within elaborate ceremonial systems designed to maintain proper relationships between human communities and supernatural powers. Mask-making traditions that create divine transformation implements require understanding of both artistic techniques and spiritual principles that govern supernatural manifestation through human intermediaries. Different mask designs enable wearers to channel specific deities during ceremonies, their visual elements coordinated with costume and performance requirements that complete transformational processes during religious activities. Ceremonial vessel production that serves ritual requirements includes containers designed for specific offering types, acoustic properties that enhance ceremonial effectiveness, and decorative elements that identify spiritual purposes while demonstrating artistic achievement. These specialized implements require technical skills that combine practical functionality with spiritual significance. Weapon consecration that transforms military implements into religious objects involves ceremonial processes that acknowledge divine sources of earthly power, while creating symbolic representations of supernatural authority that transcends human political arrangements. These sacred weapons serve ceremonial rather than combat functions, their spiritual significance outweighing practical military considerations. The El Dorado ritual that culminates years of theological development and artistic achievement represents the highest expression of Confederation religious sophistication. Preparation for this ceremony begins months before the actual event, involving not only the Zipa who will undergo transformation, but entire communities whose participation ensures the spiritual efficacy of proceedings that affect everyone's welfare. Pre-ceremonial activities that prepare communities for participation include fasting periods that purify participants while demonstrating collective commitment to spiritual objectives, educational programs that ensure proper understanding of ceremonial significance, and material preparations that provide necessary supplies while coordinating logistical requirements for complex multi-day observances. Ritual purification that prepares the Zipa for his sacred transformation requires fasting, sexual abstinence, and meditation practices that gradually separate him from ordinary human concerns while opening his consciousness to divine influences. These preparatory activities occur in sacred spaces removed from everyday activities, ensuring that spiritual preparation proceeds without interference from mundane distractions that might compromise the ceremony's effectiveness. Spiritual preparation that enables divine transformation includes educational activities that review theological principles underlying ceremonial procedures, meditation practices that achieve mental states conducive to supernatural communication, and purification rituals that cleanse participants of negative influences that might interfere with spiritual objectives. These preparatory activities require coordination between multiple priests whose specialized knowledge contributes to successful completion. The golden transformation itself begins when priests apply tree resin to the Zipa's entire body, creating a sticky surface that will hold the precious metal dust applied in subsequent steps. This resin, gathered from specific trees according to procedures sanctified by tradition, possesses spiritual properties that facilitate the magical transformation from human flesh to divine vessel, while symbolizing the natural forces that mediate between earthly and celestial realms. Resin preparation that enables golden coating involves seasonal collection activities that coordinate with natural production cycles, purification processes that remove impurities while preserving spiritual properties, and storage techniques that maintain effectiveness across extended periods between ceremonial applications. These preparatory activities require specialized knowledge about botanical properties and spiritual associations. Gold dust that covers the resin-coated body comes from deposits blessed by special ceremonies, acknowledging the spiritual significance of metals drawn from Earth's hidden treasures. The application process requires precise techniques, ensuring complete coverage while creating surface textures that catch and reflect light in patterns that enhance the visual impact of the transformed figure's appearance when illuminated by torchlight and dawn's first rays. Metallurgical preparation that produces ceremonial gold dust includes extraction techniques that preserve spiritual properties while achieving desired physical characteristics. Purification processes that remove impurities that might interfere with transformation effectiveness, and consecration rituals that acknowledge divine sources of metallic treasures while requesting supernatural cooperation in ceremonial activities. The sacred raft that carries the golden Zipa across Guatavita's waters to the ceremony's climactic moment represents craftsmanship that combines practical boat-building skills with artistic achievement and religious symbolism. Constructed from materials chosen for their spiritual significance rather than merely practical properties, this vessel embodies theological concepts while providing stable transportation for precious cargo that includes not only the transformed ruler, but offerings accumulated specifically for this ceremony. Raft construction that serves ceremonial requirements includes material selection based on spiritual associations rather than purely practical considerations. Assembly techniques that incorporate religious symbolism into structural elements and decorative features that enhance ceremonial effectiveness while demonstrating artistic achievement. These specialized vessels require coordination between multiple craftsmen whose skills contribute to successful completion. Offerings that accompany the Zyper during his journey across sacred waters include tunjos representing the community's collective prayers, emeralds symbolizing the Earth's crystallized life force, and other precious objects whose sacrifice demonstrates the community's commitment to maintaining proper relationships with divine powers. The selection and preparation of these offerings follows procedures established through generations of ceremonial experience, while incorporating innovations that reflect contemporary theological understanding. Offering preparation that serves ceremonial requirements includes selection criteria that balance material value with spiritual significance, consecration procedures that enhance religious effectiveness, and arrangement techniques that maximize ceremonial impact while ensuring proper presentation to divine recipients. These preparatory activities require coordination between multiple specialists whose expertise contributes to successful completion. The moment of transformation occurs when the golden figure emerges from lake waters, symbolically dying to his mortal nature and being reborn as a divine representative whose authority derives directly from supernatural sources rather than merely human political arrangements. This emergence, witnessed by priests and nobles whose presence validates the ceremony's authenticity, creates the theological foundation supporting Confederation governance, while renewing the spiritual contracts that bind communities together. Transformation symbolism that gives meaning to emergence activities includes death and rebirth, imagery that connects individual ceremony with cosmic cycles, purification concepts that acknowledge divine cleansing of human limitations, an authority transfer that validates political power through supernatural sanction. These symbolic elements create theological frameworks that support governmental legitimacy while providing spiritual meaning for community participants. The ritual calendar that coordinates ceremonial activities across Confederation territories ensures that major festivals occur simultaneously throughout the realm, creating shared experiences that reinforce political unity while celebrating the spiritual foundations that legitimate central authority. This synchronization requires administrative coordination combined with astronomical knowledge that enables precise timing of activities according to celestial cycles that reflect divine will, operating through natural phenomena. By this period's culmination, the religious system that governs Confederation's spiritual life achieves levels of theological sophistication and ceremonial complexity that rival achievements of any contemporary civilization. The foundation has been established for the political authority and cultural confidence that will enable the confederations to maintain independence and prosperity until external forces beyond their control arrive to challenge everything their ancestors built through generations of patient development and spiritual dedication. Beneath the crushing heat of Santa Marta, where the Caribbean sun bears down like a vengeful spirit and clouds of mosquitoes rise from rank wetlands, Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada readies a journey destined to unravel the Muisca legacy built through long and steady toil. 900 Spanish men, their armor gleaming despite tropical humidity, their weapons blessed by priests who promise divine favor for those who carry Christianity into heathen lands, prepare for a journey into territories where maps show only blank spaces, marked with warnings about savage tribes and impossible mountains. Rumors that drive this ambitious enterprise whisper of a golden king who dwells beyond the coastal ranges, a ruler so wealthy that he covers his body with precious metal dust, during ceremonies honoring gods whose names no Christian has ever heard. Venezuelan expeditions that ventured eastward brought tales of El Dorado, the gilded man, though their stories mix truth with fantasy until reality becomes indistinguishable from the fevered dreams of men driven mad by tropical diseases and unfulfilled greed. Quesada himself, a lawyer turned conquistador, whose ambitions exceed his experience in New World warfare, believes these stories because believing them justifies the enormous risks and expenses required to organize an expedition capable of penetrating territories that have already consumed previous attempts at exploration. His preparations reflect both careful planning and desperate hope, combining practical considerations about supplies and weapons with theological assumptions about divine support for enterprises that expand Christian dominion over pagan lands. The journey that begins in early 1536 transforms from organized military expedition into nightmare of survival, as coastal swamps give way to mountain ranges that seem designed by malevolent forces to destroy human intruders. The Magdalena River, that great waterway promising access to highland territories, becomes a highway of death where disease claims more victims than enemy arrows, where provisions rot in tropical humidity, where men desert in darkness rather than face another day of advancing into green hell that stretches endlessly before them. Hostile indigenous groups that control river territories attack Spanish forces with tactics perfectly adapted to jungle warfare, using knowledge of local geography to strike from concealment before vanishing into vegetation so dense that pursuit becomes impossible. Poisoned arrows that bring agonizing death, pit traps that impale unwary soldiers, night raids that leave sentries dead without alerting sleeping camps. These traditional defensive methods prove devastatingly effective against European military techniques designed for open-field battles between disciplined formations. Starvation that accompanies military harassment reduces proud conquistadors to skeletal figures whose armor hangs loose on wasted frames, whose horses die from exhaustion and inadequate forage, whose dreams of golden cities become secondary to simple survival through each hellish day. Provisions calculated to sustain 900 men for months disappear through spoilage, loss, and consumption by sick soldiers whose weakened bodies require more food than healthy men, while contributing nothing to expedition progress. Disease that spreads through cramped quarters and unsanitary conditions kills more efficiently than any enemy weapon, its victims collapsing from fevers that burn through their bodies like internal fires, while dysentery and tropical parasites complete the destruction that malnutrition begins. Medical knowledge brought from Europe proves useless against ailments unknown to Spanish physicians, while native remedies remain inaccessible due to language barriers and mutual hostility between invaders and indigenous populations. When expeditions' survivors finally emerge from jungle lowlands into highland territories, where cool air flows down from snow-capped peaks, fewer than 200 men remain from the original force that departed Santa Marta with such confidence and ambition. These scarred veterans, their faces gaunt from hunger and marked by tropical diseases, stumble into a world whose beauty and prosperity mock the suffering they have endured to reach territories that seem like paradise compared to the green hell they have escaped. First contact between Spanish survivors and Muisca populations occurs when exhausted conquistadors encounter highland farmers working terraced fields that climb mountainsides like staircases built for giants. The agricultural abundance that greets Spanish eyes, golden maize ripening in highland sun, potato varieties unknown to European agriculture, quinoa fields waving in mountain breezes, demonstrates prosperity that exceeds anything the weakened expedition members have seen since leaving Spanish territories. Muisca farmers who observe these strange bearded figures approach their settlements with caution mixed with curiosity, uncertain whether these foreign beings represent threats requiring military response or opportunities for profitable exchange. The visitors' obvious weakness and small numbers suggest they pose little immediate danger, while their exotic appearance and unknown technology create possibilities for acquiring goods unavailable through traditional networks. Initial exchanges that follow cautious approaches by both sides involve gifts calculated to demonstrate peaceful intentions, while gathering intelligence about alien capabilities and intentions. Cotton mantles woven in Highland workshops meet European glass beads, whose brilliant colors and perfect transparency seem magical to peoples whose own glass-making knowledge produces only crude imitations. Metal tools forged from Highland copper compare favorably with Spanish steel implements, whose superiority becomes apparent only through extended use and comparison. Communication barriers that prevent meaningful dialogue between groups speaking completely different languages force both sides to rely on gestures, demonstrations, and gift exchanges that convey basic intentions while leaving complex negotiations impossible. Spanish attempts to inquire about gold sources through pantomime and crude drawings meet with responses that may indicate understanding or complete confusion, while Muisca efforts to learn about Spanish origins and purposes encounter similar difficulties. Misunderstandings that result from cultural differences and language barriers create tensions that escalate when Spanish demands for food and shelter exceed what Highland communities consider reasonable requests from guests whose presence brings no obvious benefits. European concepts of hospitality that expect unlimited support for travelers conflict with Muisca customs that balance generosity with practical limitations, creating friction that threatens to explode into violence. News of strange visitors spreads through Highland territories faster than the Spanish expedition can travel, carried by messenger networks that enable rapid communication between settlements throughout Confederation domains. Reports describing bearded beings who ride four-legged monsters, whose skin shines like metal, whose weapons produce thunder and lightning, reach royal courts where advisors debate appropriate responses to phenomena that challenge traditional understanding of natural and supernatural realms. Tiscasusa, the Zaipa, whose authority extends over southern Confederation territories, including the sacred lake where El Dorado's ceremonies bind earthly power to divine sanction, receives these reports with growing alarm as their implications become clear. These strangers, whatever their origins, represent forces capable of disrupting the carefully balanced systems that maintain Confederation prosperity and spiritual harmony. The last Great Zipa's initial response reflects both political calculation and religious obligation, as he considers options ranging from accommodation through resistance to outright warfare. Diplomatic overtures that might transform potential enemies into useful allies compete with military preparations designed to eliminate threats before they can establish footholds in Confederation territories. Religious consultations with priests who interpret divine will through astronomical observations and sacred rituals provide spiritual guidance for decisions whose consequences will affect countless future generations. Military preparations that begin as precautionary measures escalate into active resistance when Spanish behavior demonstrates intentions that threaten Confederation independence and territorial integrity. Demands for tribute payments, insistence on establishing permanent camps in sacred locations, an obvious interest in locating gold sources convince Highland leaders that accommodation will lead to subjugation rather than mutually beneficial partnership. Traditional weapons that served Confederation forces effectively in conflicts with neighboring peoples prove inadequate against Spanish military technology, particularly steel armor that turns aside copper-tipped spears and shields that deflect bronze-headed arrows. Highland warriors, whose courage and skill dominate regional battlefields, discover that individual heroism cannot overcome technological disadvantages that favor even weakened European forces. The Battle of Funza that seals Southern Confederation fate occurs when Tiscazuza leads personally chosen warriors in desperate attempt to drive invaders from territories they have no right to occupy. Highland forces that attack with traditional tactics suitable for fighting enemies, equipped with similar weapons, meet devastating volleys from Spanish crossbows and harquebus fire that kills at distances far exceeding native weapon ranges. Spanish horses, whose speed and shock value terrorize foot soldiers unaccustomed to mounted warfare, scatter Highland formations despite numerical superiority that should favor defending forces. Cavalry charges that break Muisca battle lines demonstrate advantages that European military organization gains from combined arms tactics, integrating mounted and foot soldiers, artillery support, and coordinated maneuvers impossible for forces lacking similar equipment and training. Tiscazuza's death in this engagement eliminates the last legitimate authority capable of organizing effective resistance to Spanish occupation, while destroying the political structures that maintained Southern Confederation unity. His body, pierced by Spanish steel that no traditional armor could deflect, marks the end of independence that lasted from Bachue's emergence from sacred waters, until foreign weapons silenced voices that spoke for mountain spirits and highland peoples. Northern territories, under Zark authority, initially attempt different approaches to Spanish presence, hoping that accommodation and controlled cooperation might preserve essential autonomy while avoiding the destruction that befell southern domains. Aquimenzarche, whose emerald wealth provides resources for negotiation and whose mountain strongholds offer defensive advantages, seeks arrangements that might satisfy Spanish demands without completely surrendering Confederation independence. These diplomatic efforts fail when Spanish greed proves insatiable, and their theological assumptions about Christian superiority over pagan religions make genuine partnership impossible. Demands that begin with requests for tribute escalate into requirements for complete submission to Spanish authority and abandonment of traditional religious practices that provide spiritual foundations for Confederation society. The conquest of Tunja that follows demonstrates Spanish ability to overcome even the strongest defensive positions through combination of military pressure, psychological warfare, and exploitation of internal divisions within target communities. Artillery bombardment that breaks mountain fortifications, followed by assault techniques that Spanish forces perfected during European campaigns, proves that geography alone cannot preserve independence. When defenders lack technological and organizational advantages needed to counter superior military capabilities, Aquimenzarche's capture during the fall of his capital eliminates Northern Confederation leadership, while providing Spanish forces with hostage, whose value enables extraction of information about hidden treasures and secret locations where resistance might continue. Torture techniques that Spanish forces employ to break indigenous resistance reflect both practical interrogation methods and theological assumptions about appropriate treatment of pagans who reject Christian conversion. Systematic looting that follows military victory strips Confederation territories of portable wealth, while destroying religious artifacts whose spiritual significance Spanish conquerors cannot comprehend. Sacred objects that embodied generations of theological development and artistic achievement become raw materials for melting down into ingots whose weight and purity matter more than cultural meanings lost forever when flames consume what hammers cannot break. Lake Guatavita, that sacred center where El Dorado ceremonies connected earthly authority with divine power, attracts Spanish attention as reports of underwater treasures inspire efforts to drain waters that hide offerings accumulated through centuries of religious observance. Engineering projects that attempt to lower lake levels through constructed channels reflect European technical knowledge, while demonstrating complete disregard for spiritual considerations that made these waters sacred to highland peoples. Disease that accompanies Spanish occupation proves more devastating than military conquest in destroying Confederation populations, whose immune systems lack resistance to European pathogens. Smallpox epidemics that race ahead of Spanish armies reduce highland settlements to ghostly remnants of their former prosperity, while other ailments complete demographic catastrophe that warfare began but could never accomplish alone. Survivors who escape initial conquest and disease outbreaks flee to remote mountain refuges where traditional life might continue despite Spanish occupation of major population centers. These displaced communities carry cultural knowledge and religious traditions into hidden valleys, where resistance to foreign domination takes forms of preservation rather than military opposition, maintaining identity through memory when armed struggle becomes impossible. The execution of Aquiminzaque in 1540, that final act eliminating the last legitimate Confederation authority, symbolizes more than political conquest. It represents the end of civilizational independence that began with divine teachings beside sacred lakes and culminated in sophisticated societies capable of creating beauty that transcended material necessity. Spanish banners that replace sacred symbols throughout highland territories mark transformation that reduces living culture to historical memory, converting spiritual landscapes into commercial resources, serving distant masters whose interests have nothing in common with mountain people's welfare. Colonial administration that replaces Confederation governance imposes European legal concepts and economic systems designed to extract wealth for Spanish benefit, rather than maintain prosperity for highland populations. Encomienda, grants that divide territories among conquistadors, treat indigenous communities as resources to be exploited rather than societies worthy of respect, while tribute obligations that exceed traditional levels drain resources needed for community survival and cultural continuity. Catholic evangelization that accompanies political conquest targets traditional religious practices as demonic influences requiring elimination through force if persuasion fails. Sacred sites that served as focal points for Confederation's spiritual life face systematic destruction as priests and soldiers work to erase every trace of beliefs that provided meaning and purpose for highland peoples across countless generations of development and achievement. The transformation that occurs between 1536 and 1540 represents one of history's most dramatic civilizational ruptures, as societies that achieved remarkable sophistication in agriculture, metallurgy, political organization, and religious expression disappear beneath foreign systems that value only extractable wealth and convertible souls. The Confederation that commanded respect throughout highland territories becomes memory, while El Dorado evolves from sacred ceremony into legend that will inspire treasure hunters whose searches ignore the spiritual significance that gave meaning to golden offerings now scattered on lake bottoms and melted into ingots serving European commercial purposes. 40 years after Aquiminzaque's execution silenced the last voice of highland independence, Lake Guatavita reflects a changed world in its sacred waters, where once the zipper underwent divine transformation beneath starlit skies. Now foreign engineers survey the circular basin with calculating eyes, their minds focused not on spiritual significance but on the treasure that legend claims lies hidden beneath waters that have swallowed offerings for countless generations. The lake that witnessed the birth of El Dorado's ceremonies will soon become the testing ground for imperial obsessions that transform sacred ritual into commercial enterprise. Antonio de Sepulveda, that ambitious merchant whose wealth enables grand schemes beyond the reach of ordinary colonists, gazes across Guatavita's still surface while envisioning engineering projects that will drain these holy waters and expose the accumulated riches of centuries to foreign hands. His calculations blend practical knowledge, gained through years in the Indies, with wild speculation about the value of artifacts that native informants describe in whispered conversations. Their reluctant testimony, extracted through methods that make clear the consequences of withholding information from administrative authorities. The drainage project that Sepulveda launches in 1580 represents the culmination of decades of imperial dreaming about highland treasures, combining overseas technical expertise with local labor conscripted for purposes that violate every principle the workers' ancestors held sacred. Thousands of native workers, their bodies weakened by disease, and their spirits broken by forced conversion to alien religions, begin the massive undertaking of channeling sacred waters through artificial outlets carved into the crater's rim. Engineering techniques that enable this unprecedented project demonstrate both the sophistication of continental hydraulic knowledge and the complete disregard for local spiritual concerns that characterizes imperial enterprise. Channels cut through solid rock require moving quantities of stone that would challenge modern equipment, while wooden frameworks supporting earthworks demand forests of timber harvested from mountains that were once considered sacred groves where spirits dwelled in peace. Month by month, the water level drops as constructed outlets channel Guatavita's contents towards streams that carry these blessed waters away from their eternal resting place toward distant rivers that flow unconscious of the sacrilege they bear. Local workers who witness this systematic desecration weep for ancestors whose offerings to the gods now lie exposed to foreign eyes that see only commercial value in objects that once bridged earthly and divine realms. Artifacts that emerge from the drained sections exceed even expectations in their variety and artistic sophistication, though their total value proves disappointingly modest compared to conquistador fantasies about rooms filled with precious metal. Golden tunjos that once carried prayers to supernatural powers become curiosities weighed for their metallic content. Emerald ornaments that symbolized Earth's crystallized life force transform into gemstones valued for their market price rather than spiritual significance. Each recovered object tells stories that settler minds cannot comprehend, their forms encoding theological concepts and ceremonial purposes that disappear forever when native knowledge holders die without passing their wisdom to survivors capable of preserving cultural memory. Miniature figures depicting priests in ritual poses, animals that represented spiritual forces, abstract forms that symbolized cosmic principles, all become mere archaeological specimens whose meanings vanish with the destruction of the civilization that created them. The partial success of Sepulveda's drainage operation, which recovers significant quantities of precious objects while failing to expose the lake's deepest deposits, paradoxically strengthens rather than satisfies administrative obsessions with El Dorado treasures. Overseas imagination, inflamed by tangible evidence that local accounts of underwater riches contain elements of truth, transforms Guatavita's partial revelation into proof that even greater treasures await discovery in other locations throughout the former Muisca domains. Documentary evidence that emerges from this enterprise spreads throughout the imperial network, carrying detailed descriptions of recovered artifacts to distant authorities, whose own dreams of golden cities receive fresh encouragement from reports that validate the most optimistic assumptions about New World wealth. Administrative chroniclers who record these discoveries add their own embellishments to native accounts, creating hybrid narratives that blend factual observation with overseas fantasy in proportions that make truth indistinguishable from fiction. Gold fever that spreads from these documented discoveries extends far beyond the highland domains where El Dorado ceremonies actually occurred, inspiring ventures that search for golden cities in regions where no such settlements ever existed. Venezuelan explorers who venture into Orinoco headwaters carry maps marked with locations where local informants claim to have knowledge of wealthy civilizations, though these testimonies often result from leading questions that suggest desired answers rather than genuine geographical information. Sir Walter Raleigh, that ambitious English courtier whose political survival depends upon delivering spectacular discoveries to his royal patron, organizes multiple ventures based on reports that filter northward from imperial regions through networks of international espionage and commercial intelligence. His journeys into Guianan highlands reflect both genuine belief in El Dorado legends and desperate need to find sources of wealth sufficient to maintain his position at Elizabeth's court, where failure to produce results brings consequences more severe than physical dangers encountered in tropical exploration. Raleigh's written accounts of his Venezuelan adventures, published for English audiences hungry for tales of exotic lands and fabulous riches, blend careful geographical observation with literary elaboration, designed to maintain interest in further ventures. His descriptions of native peoples who supposedly possess knowledge of golden cities create new layers of mythology around El Dorado legends, while establishing English claims to lands that Spain considers integral parts of its American empire. Amazon ventures that follow rumors of golden cities deep in continental interiors launch from bases established by Francisco Orellana during his legendary descent of the Great River System. These enterprises, organized by conquistadors whose earlier undertakings failed to produce expected wealth, represent last desperate attempts to locate treasures sufficient to justify decades of investment in South American exploration and conquest. Orellana's own accounts of his river journey, which describe encounters with wealthy civilizations dwelling in regions accessible only by water, inspire subsequent ventures that search for tributary systems leading to highland areas where golden cities allegedly flourish beyond the reach of administrative control. These narratives, embellished through multiple retellings, create geographical fantasies that persist long after their origins in specific historical encounters become obscured by accumulated mythological additions. The geographic expansion of El Dorado mythology reflects both the practical needs of administrative officials seeking to justify continued expenditure on exploration, and the psychological requirements of overseas settlers whose survival in harsh American environments depends upon maintaining hope that eventual discoveries will compensate for present hardships. Each failed venture generates new theories about El Dorado's location, rather than questioning fundamental assumptions about Golden City's existence. Maps produced during this period show shifting locations for El Dorado that migrate across South American geography, according to the most recent reports from returning ventures. Cartographers who never visited American domains create representations based on conflicting testimonies, from explorers whose accounts mix authentic geographical knowledge with speculative additions designed to maintain financial support for future enterprises. Within former Muisca lands, imperial administration transforms traditional economic systems through implementation of encomienda grants that assign local populations to overseas colonists, authorized to extract labor and tribute in exchange for providing religious instruction and physical protection. These arrangements, designed to benefit foreign settlers while maintaining theoretical concern for native welfare, create new forms of exploitation that prove more systematic and devastating than the irregular warfare that characterized the conquest period. Encomienda holders who receive grants of native workers and agricultural lands focus their attention on maximizing short-term profits rather than maintaining long-term productivity of human and natural resources under their control. Traditional farming techniques that sustained highland agriculture for generations yield to intensive cultivation methods designed to produce immediate returns for export to overseas markets, regardless of environmental consequences that accumulate over time. Salt mining operations that once served Confederation needs through carefully managed extraction become industrial enterprises operated for settler profit without regard for sustainability or worker welfare. Foreign techniques that enable deeper excavation and larger scale production exhaust deposits more rapidly while creating working conditions that prove fatal to laborers whose ancestors regarded these underground chambers as sacred spaces deserving reverent treatment. Emerald extraction that expands under administrative management reflects both continental technical capabilities and complete disregard for local spiritual beliefs about proper relationships with geological forces. Overseas, mining methods that penetrate deeper into mountain hearts than traditional techniques ever attempted encounter resistance from workers who believe these intrusions will anger supernatural powers governing Earth's hidden treasures. Catholic missionary campaigns that accompany economic transformation target traditional religious practices as obstacles to both spiritual salvation and economic productivity. Dominican and Franciscan friars who establish schools and churches throughout former Confederation domains work systematically to erase native spiritual traditions while replacing them with Christian beliefs adapted to imperial social requirements. Sacred sites that served as focal points for traditional ceremonies face systematic destruction as priests and administrative officials collaborate to eliminate physical reminders of pagan practices. Temples that housed astronomical instruments useful for agricultural timing disappear beneath churches whose orientation reflects overseas architectural traditions rather than highland environmental conditions. Local ceremonial objects that survive the initial conquest period become targets for systematic collection and destruction by missionary authorities, determined to eliminate all traces of devil worship from regions under their spiritual jurisdiction. Golden artifacts that once facilitated communication with divine powers are melted down to create church ornaments that serve Christian rather than traditional religious purposes. Traditional festivals that marked agricultural cycles and celestial events undergo forced transformation into Christian celebrations whose timing and content reflect continental rather than highland cultural requirements. Local communities that attempt to maintain seasonal observances find themselves accused of practicing witchcraft and devil worship, with severe penalties imposed on participants who refuse to abandon ancestral customs. The Chibcha language that once unified diverse highland populations through shared vocabulary and literary traditions faces systematic suppression, as administrative education policy demands exclusive use of Spanish in all official communications and formal instruction. Native children who attend missionary schools receive punishment for speaking their ancestral tongue, while adults discover that economic advancement requires abandoning linguistic heritage in favor of overseas communication systems. Oral traditions that preserved historical memory and cultural values through generations of careful transmission find themselves without audiences as younger people focused their attention on acquiring skills necessary for survival in imperial society. Epic poems that celebrated Confederation heroes disappear with the death of storytellers whose knowledge dies unrecorded, while mythological narratives that explained natural phenomena yield to Christian teachings about divine creation and supernatural intervention. Within this context of systematic cultural destruction, the El Dorado legend undergoes fundamental transformation that separates it completely from its origins in Muisca religious practice. Administrative writers who record local accounts of golden ceremonies interpret these descriptions according to foreign assumptions about primitive superstition and barbarous customs, creating literary representations that bear little resemblance to the sophisticated theological concepts that originally gave meaning to ritual transformation. Overseas chroniclers, whose works circulate throughout continental intellectual circles, present El Dorado as evidence of native peoples' obsession with material wealth, rather than recognition of complex spiritual relationships between earthly authority and divine sanction. These misinterpretations, reinforced by archaeological discoveries that focus attention on precious metal content rather than artistic achievement, establish literary traditions that persist long after their factual foundations disappear. Commercial exploitation of El Dorado imagery begins during this period as merchants and promoters use references to golden cities and gilded kings to attract investment in American ventures that have little connection to actual highland domains. The legendary Golden King becomes a marketing symbol that promises fabulous returns on imperial investments while obscuring the reality of systematic exploitation that characterizes actual economic relationships between foreign settlers and local populations. Literary elaboration that transforms El Dorado from specific historical ceremony into universal symbol of unattainable wealth reflects broader continental psychological needs rather than accurate understanding of American civilizations. The Golden King, who covers his body with precious metal, becomes a figure representing both the exotic appeal of distant lands and the ultimate futility of pursuing material satisfaction through geographical exploration. By the century's end, the legend that began with sacred ceremonies at Lake Guatavita has evolved into mythological construct that bears no resemblance to its historical origins, while serving multiple purposes in overseas culture that have nothing to do with understanding Native American societies. El Dorado becomes simultaneously a symbol of New World opportunity, a cautionary tale about the dangers of excessive materialism, and a literary device for exploring themes of quest and discovery that resonate with foreign audiences regardless of their accuracy regarding American realities. The irony that emerges from this transformation reveals the fundamental disconnect between foreign imperial enterprise and Native American achievement. A civilization that created sophisticated artistic and spiritual traditions focused on maintaining harmony between human communities and natural forces becomes remembered only for legendary wealth that existed primarily in conquistador imaginations, while the actual accomplishments that enabled Muisca society to flourish for generations disappear beneath administrative systems that value only extractable resources and convertible souls, where time-worn monuments crumble beneath the weight of forgotten glory. Kin of the lake-born children of Bachuay gather quietly in hidden mountain folds, among terraces that still climb like whispered prayers toward the cloud-veiled heights. The year 1600 finds these survivors living lives their ancestors could never have imagined, subjects of distant monarchs whose portraits hang in churches built over sacred sites, speakers of forbidden languages that grow more silent with each passing season, keepers of memories that imperial law brands as dangerous superstition worthy of punishment by fire. Central authority that once coordinated activities across vast highland domains has dissolved into village-level governance where local chiefs, stripped of their traditional titles and divine sanction, struggle to maintain community welfare under administrative systems designed to extract wealth rather than preserve social harmony. The elaborate networks of tribute, marriage alliance, and ceremonial obligation that bound diverse settlements into unified confederations survive only in the whispered recollections of elders whose knowledge dies with them, unrecorded and increasingly irrelevant to children who must learn new ways of surviving in a world that offers no rewards for remembering ancient glories. Spanish municipal organization that replaces traditional governance structures imposes foreign concepts of law and authority upon communities whose understanding of proper relationships between rulers and subjects developed over generations of cultural evolution. Where once caciques earned respect through demonstrated wisdom and spiritual connection to mountain deities, now appointed officials derive their power from distant authorities who measure success through tax collection and religious compliance rather than community prosperity or cultural preservation. Villages that once sent representatives to Confederation councils, where decisions affected territories spanning multiple ecological zones, now find themselves isolated units answerable only to encomenderos, whose interests focus entirely on maximizing short-term profits from assigned populations. The sophisticated systems of resource sharing that enabled highland communities to survive periodic droughts and crop failures through mutual support disappear beneath administrative arrangements that treat indigenous settlements as separate economic units competing for limited Spanish favor. Yet beneath this imposed fragmentation, traditional kinship networks persist like underground streams flowing through landscapes transformed by surface upheavals. Marriage customs that once cemented political alliances between Confederation territories adapt to serve different purposes, creating bonds between communities that enable discreet resistance to foreign control while maintaining cultural continuity through family connections that transcend administrative boundaries. Grandmothers who remember the old ways teach their grandchildren genealogies that preserve claims to traditional lands and noble status, even when such knowledge brings no immediate practical benefit and considerable potential danger. The spiritual transformation that accompanies political collapse proves both more complete and more superficial than Spanish authorities recognize. Catholic saints whose feast days replace traditional festival calendars acquire characteristics that mirror the deities they supposedly supersede, their miracles and intercessions interpreted through theological frameworks that owe more to Highland cosmology than Roman doctrine. The Virgin Mary, elevated to supreme spiritual authority in mission churches, receives devotions that echo ceremonies once offered to Chia, while Christ's suffering and resurrection resonate with indigenous concepts of divine sacrifice and seasonal renewal. St. James, that warrior saint whose image adorns church altars throughout former Confederation territories, becomes the focus of devotional practices that blend Christian hagiography with memories of Bochica, the bearded civilizer whose legendary interventions saved ancient peoples from natural disasters. Prayers addressed to the Christian saint carry requests that mirror petitions once offered to indigenous deities, while ritual gestures that accompany worship incorporate movements that preserve traditional ceremonial forms, despite their transformation into acceptable Christian expressions. Underground continuity of traditional spiritual practices requires careful adaptation to avoid detection by missionary authorities, whose theological training enables them to recognize pagan elements embedded within apparently orthodox Christian observances. Sacred sites that once hosted elaborate public ceremonies become destinations for private pilgrimages undertaken under cover of darkness, their ancient power accessed through simplified rituals that preserve essential spiritual connections while minimizing exposure to Spanish surveillance. Lake Iguaque, that primordial source where Bachué first emerged with her infant companion, continues to draw believers who journey through mountain passes to reach waters that retain their capacity to provide spiritual renewal, despite decades of official prohibition against traditional worship. Offerings left at the lake's edge reflect both continuity and adaptation. Flower petals and small coins replacing golden tunjos, whispered prayers in Chibcha, substituting for elaborate chanted ceremonies, individual devotion superseding community-wide festivals that might attract unwanted attention. The Chibcha language that once unified diverse highland populations through shared vocabulary and ceremonial expressions faces systematic suppression that threatens its survival within a generation. Administrative policy that mandates Spanish for all official communications combines with economic pressure that rewards European linguistic competence to create conditions where indigenous languages become associated with poverty and social marginalization, rather than cultural heritage worthy of preservation. Children who attend mission schools receive physical punishment for speaking their ancestral tongue, while parents discover that fluency in Spanish provides their offspring with advantages unavailable to monolingual Chibcha speakers. This linguistic transition, enforced through both coercion and incentive, represents more than simple communication change. It embodies the gradual erosion of conceptual frameworks that enabled traditional understanding of natural phenomena, social relationships, and spiritual realities. Yet even as public use of Chibcha disappears from highland settlements, the language persists in domestic contexts where families maintain traditional naming practices, preserve ceremonial formulas, and transmit cultural knowledge through stories that can only be properly understood in their original linguistic form. Elderly speakers who remember the Confederation period become living libraries whose memories preserve not merely vocabulary, but entire worldviews that enabled their ancestors to create sophisticated civilizations in harmony with highland environments. Secret storytelling sessions that occur in remote locations or during religious festivals when Spanish oversight relaxes provide opportunities for cultural transmission that adapts traditional narrative forms to contemporary circumstances. Epic poems that once celebrated Confederation heroes evolve into cautionary tales about the dangers of challenging foreign authority, while creation myths that explain the origins of highland landscapes acquire new meanings that help communities understand their place within transformed social realities. Healing practices that blend traditional plant knowledge with Christian prayer demonstrate the syncretic character of cultural resistance that preserves essential elements of indigenous wisdom while accommodating Spanish religious requirements. Curanderos who serve highland communities must navigate carefully between demonstrating therapeutic effectiveness that maintains their social value and avoiding accusations of witchcraft that could result in prosecution by Inquisition authorities increasingly concerned about surviving pagan influences. Traditional medical knowledge that accumulated through generations of careful observation and experimentation adapts to serve communities whose health problems include new diseases, introduced by European contact alongside familiar ailments that afflicted their ancestors. Native healers who understand the medicinal properties of highland plants combine this knowledge with Christian invocations and saint veneration to create therapeutic practices that satisfy both practical needs and religious requirements imposed by Spanish authorities. Sacred geography that provided spiritual frameworks for traditional religious practice retains its significance even as official Christianity transforms the interpretation of landscape features once considered manifestations of divine power. Mountain peaks that housed spirits in ancient cosmologies become associated with Christian saints whose intercession protects travelers and shepherds, while springs that once provided access to supernatural realms serve as sources of holy water, blessed by priests who remain unaware of their pre-Christian significance. Hidden ceremonies that continue at traditional sacred sites require careful timing and discreet participation to avoid detection by Spanish surveillance networks that rely heavily on indigenous informants motivated by rewards and social advancement within administrative systems. Participants in these clandestine observances develop sophisticated methods for organizing gatherings that appear to serve secular purposes, while actually preserving spiritual connections to ancestral traditions. Population decline that results from continued epidemic disease and economic exploitation reduces highland settlements to fractions of their pre-contact size while fundamentally altering demographic patterns that sustain traditional social organization. Entire family lines disappear through disease mortality, breaking kinship networks that preserved cultural knowledge and maintained connections between scattered communities. Villages that once supported diverse specialist roles, astronomers, metal workers, textile producers, lose the population base necessary for such cultural complexity. Survivors who remain in highland settlements after demographic catastrophe has eliminated substantial portions of their communities, face challenges that require abandoning traditional economic practices in favor of strategies that enable bare survival under Spanish administrative systems. Farming techniques that sustained prosperity for generations yield to subsistence cultivation, focused on crops that Spanish authorities value, while traditional crafts that once created objects of spiritual and aesthetic significance disappear as their practitioners die without trained successors. Economic adaptation that enables community survival often requires accepting roles within Spanish commercial networks that provide income but undermine traditional values and social relationships. Indigenous artisans who once created ceremonial objects for Confederation elite adapt their skills to producing goods for European markets, their traditional artistic knowledge channeled into creating items that serve foreign aesthetic preferences rather than preserving cultural heritage. Salt extraction that continues under Spanish supervision employs indigenous workers whose ancestors regarded mining as sacred activity, requiring ritual preparation and spiritual protection. Modern industrial methods that maximize production efficiency eliminate ceremonial elements that once provided meaning and social cohesion for mining communities, reducing spiritual vocation to wage labor performed under conditions that prioritize output over worker welfare or environmental sustainability. Emerald mining that expands under administrative oversight requires indigenous workers to penetrate deeper into mountain hearts than traditional techniques ever attempted, creating working conditions that prove frequently fatal while generating profits that flow entirely to Spanish owners. Workers whose cultural heritage includes stories about supernatural forces governing geological processes find themselves compelled to violate traditional prohibitions against disturbing earth spirits in exchange for wages that barely sustain their families. Textile production that once created garments encoding cultural meanings through patterns and colors that carried spiritual significance adapts to serve Spanish demand for practical clothing that reflects European aesthetic preferences rather than indigenous artistic traditions. Weavers who preserve knowledge of traditional techniques use their skills to create products that generate income while abandoning the symbolic dimensions that made their craft an expression of cultural identity rather than mere economic activity. Agricultural labor that sustains Spanish estates often requires indigenous workers to cultivate crops intended for export rather than local consumption, creating food security problems that traditional farming methods specifically avoided through emphasis on diverse cultivation that provided nutritional security during harvest failures. Traditional, ecological knowledge that enabled sustainable highland agriculture for generations becomes irrelevant when economic success depends upon maximizing production of specific crops demanded by European markets. Legal struggles that arise from competing claims about land ownership reflect fundamental conflicts between Spanish property concepts based on individual title and indigenous understanding of territorial relationships that emphasized community stewardship and spiritual connection to specific landscapes. Traditional leaders who attempt to defend ancestral territories through Spanish court systems find themselves navigating legal frameworks that provide no recognition for the cultural and spiritual foundations underlying their claims. Documentary evidence that supports indigenous land claims often depends upon Spanish colonial records that recognize certain traditional authorities while ignoring the complex kinship and ceremonial relationships that legitimated territorial control within Confederation political systems. Communities that can demonstrate continuous occupation of specific areas sometimes achieve legal recognition of their claims, but usually under terms that fundamentally alter their relationship to the land by treating it as commodity rather than sacred heritage. Tribute obligations that replace traditional patterns of resource sharing impose systematic extraction that drains community resources while providing no reciprocal benefits of the kind that legitimated ancient taxation systems. Spanish colonial administration treats tribute as simple payment for the privilege of remaining on ancestral lands, rather than contribution to collective enterprises that enhance community welfare through coordinated infrastructure development and mutual support during emergencies. Marriage law that adapts traditional customs to Spanish legal requirements preserves certain indigenous practices while eliminating aspects that conflict with Christian doctrine or colonial administrative needs. Traditional polygamy that enabled political alliance formation disappears beneath monogamous marriage requirements, while kinship rules that prevented certain unions yield to Christian prohibitions that reflect different understanding of appropriate family relationships. Inheritance practices that once preserved community solidarity through collective ownership of essential resources adapt to accommodate Spanish emphasis on individual property rights that enable accumulation of wealth across generations. Traditional systems that distributed resources according to need and prevented excessive inequality disappear beneath legal frameworks that encourage individual advancement while accepting community-wide impoverishment as natural consequence of personal failure. Criminal justice that emerges from the intersection of traditional customs and Spanish legal systems creates hybrid approaches that attempt to maintain community harmony while satisfying colonial requirements for punishment that demonstrates respect for Spanish authority. Indigenous communities that prefer restorative approaches focused on repairing social relationships find themselves compelled to accept retributive punishments that satisfy Spanish concepts of appropriate justice, while sometimes undermining traditional methods for maintaining social cohesion. Educational practices that preserve essential cultural knowledge adapt to circumstances where formal instruction occurs in Spanish-dominated institutions that actively discourage indigenous cultural transmission. Traditional apprenticeship systems that transmitted specialized skills from masters to carefully selected students continue in modified form, but focus increasingly on practical abilities that enable economic survival rather than preserving cultural knowledge that appears to have no contemporary relevance. By the middle of the 17th century, Highland communities that trace their descent to Confederation peoples have developed survival strategies that enable cultural persistence within imperial administrative frameworks that officially deny the legitimacy of indigenous identity claims. These adaptations require constant negotiation between preservation of ancestral wisdom and accommodation of Spanish requirements, creating hybrid communities that maintain essential connections to traditional heritage while accepting practical necessities imposed by colonial domination. Genealogical memory that preserves knowledge of pre-conquest nobility and territorial claims provides psychological foundations for communities whose contemporary circumstances offer little evidence of their ancestors' achievements. Families that maintain traditional naming practices and preserve stories about Confederation heroes create alternative sources of identity and self-respect that enable survival of cultural pride, despite systematic efforts to convince indigenous populations that their heritage represents primitive ignorance deserving only shame and abandonment. Cultural pride that survives despite colonial persecution finds expression in discrete forms that avoid direct confrontation with Spanish authority, while maintaining essential connections to ancestral traditions. Artistic motifs that appear in textiles and pottery preserve traditional symbolic systems under guise of decorative patterns, while storytelling that occurs during work activities transmits cultural knowledge through narratives that appear to serve entertainment purposes, rather than preserving dangerous memories of indigenous political and spiritual autonomy. The stage now stands set for the final transformation that will complete the destruction of Confederation identity, while preserving certain cultural elements in forms so changed that their origins become unrecognizable, even to descendants of those who once participated in sacred ceremonies at Lake Guatavita. What survives of Muisca heritage enters the 18th century as fragmentary traditions maintained by communities that remember their greatness only in whispered stories that grow fainter with each passing generation, where mist still curls above the old highland lakes. Just like when Bashwe emerged from the sacred depths, the 18th century rolls in, marking the end of everything that once distinguished the Muisca from those around them. The scattered families who trace their bloodlines to Confederation nobility find themselves indistinguishable from thousands of other indigenous subjects scattered throughout Spain's American dominions, their ancestral territories completely absorbed into administrative units that serve imperial rather than local needs. Spanish administrators, whose jurisdictions include valleys, where the Zipper once held court review tribute records that classify highland settlements according to productivity rather than cultural heritage. Colonial ledgers list population numbers, agricultural yields, and tax obligations without distinguishing between communities whose ancestors built confederations and recent migrants from distant provinces. When these officials travel through territories that once formed the Confederation's heartland, they observe only peaceful agricultural settlements whose residents speak fluent Spanish and attend Catholic Mass with devotion that suggests complete religious conversion. Administrative reports submitted to viceregal authorities describe highland populations as industrious and compliant subjects whose agricultural productivity and religious orthodoxy demonstrate successful integration into imperial systems. These bureaucratic documents preserve no memory of the sophisticated political structures that once coordinated activities across diverse ecological zones. Their authors unaware that the terraced fields they praise were designed by engineers whose astronomical knowledge enabled precise agricultural timing. Indigenous families whose great-grandfathers served as caciques under Confederation authority now work in monasteries built over sites where sacred ceremonies once connected earthly rulers with divine powers. Their children speak only Spanish and attend mission schools where Franciscan friars teach them to read Latin prayers and calculate sums for commercial transactions. When children ask about family history, parents tell stories about noble ancestors whose actual significance they cannot explain. Their achievements reduce to fragmentary memories that provide no practical relevance for contemporary survival. Family genealogies that survive consist of names without context, references to ancestors who served great lords of Bakatar or Hunza. But neither parents nor children understand what such service meant or why it once commanded respect throughout Highland territories. These ancestral claims become curiosities mentioned only during family gatherings. Their historical significance is forgotten as the language in which those ancestors conducted their ceremonies and negotiations. Catholic priests whose missions encompass territories where pilgrims once journeyed to sacred lakes note in their correspondence that indigenous parishioners display remarkable devotion to saints whose feast days attract thousands of celebrants. They attribute this spiritual fervor to successful evangelization, rather than recognizing seasonal patterns that echo ancient agricultural cycles. Ecclesiastical reports to religious superiors describe peaceful communities whose orthodoxy provides no indication of the sophisticated theological systems that once governed Highland spiritual life. Parish registers maintained by colonial clergy record baptisms, marriages, and deaths in communities where every resident bears a Spanish Christian name and follows Catholic ritual requirements. These documents preserve no trace of the naming customs that once connected individuals to astronomical phenomena, sacred geography, or divine relationships that structured traditional identity. When indigenous families choose saints' names for their children, they make selections based on Catholic calendar convenience rather than spiritual associations that once linked personal identity to cosmic forces. The death of elderly indigenous women who remembered fragments of traditional songs marks the gradual disappearance of linguistic connections to Confederation heritage. These final speakers of Chibcha vocabulary take with them the last traces of a language that once unified diverse Highland populations, so through shared cultural expressions. Their funerals, conducted entirely in Spanish with Catholic rituals, attract neighbors who remember them as skilled weavers and devoted grandmothers, but none who recognize them as keepers of linguistic traditions that stretched back to Bachue's first teachings. Death notices that parish priests record for these elderly women describe them as exemplary Christian believers who raised children in the faith and contributed to church construction. Official documentation preserves no mention of the traditional knowledge they carried, the ceremonies they remembered, or the cultural continuity that ended with their passing. Their grandchildren, who speak only Spanish and work as laborers on colonial estates, inherit looms and cooking pots, but nothing of the intellectual heritage that once made their bloodlines significant within Confederation society. Spanish landowners, whose haciendas encompass valleys, where Confederation agriculture once flourished, employ indigenous workers whose ancestors designed the terracing systems that still provide the foundation for estate productivity. These laborers maintain ancestral techniques through practical necessity, their knowledge valued only for its economic utility, while its intellectual and spiritual foundations remain completely unrecognized by employers who attribute agricultural success to European management and imported seeds. Hacienda account books record impressive yields from fields whose productivity depends upon indigenous engineering knowledge, but these documents credit all achievements to improved methods introduced through oversight. When estate owners write to relatives in Spain describing Highland agriculture, they mention the natural aptitude of indigenous workers without recognizing the generations of accumulated expertise that enable their superior performance in mountain environments. Indigenous workers who maintain irrigation channels that feed the most productive colonial estates learned water management techniques from fathers who learned from grandfathers, creating unbroken chains of practical knowledge that extend back to Confederation engineers. Yet these workers cannot explain why certain channel angles work better than others, or why specific stone arrangements prevent erosion during heavy rains. The intellectual frameworks that once gave meaning to these techniques disappeared generations ago, leaving only mechanical repetition of procedures whose effectiveness depends upon forgotten principles. Colonial administrators of salt works at Zipaquira report to their superiors that indigenous workers display unusual skill in underground navigation and deposit identification, attributing these capabilities to natural inclination, rather than recognizing the cultural knowledge that enables effective performance in subterranean environments. Production reports document yields that depend upon traditional expertise, while crediting all achievements to imported techniques and European supervision. Indigenous miners, whose family names preserve the locations of ancient salt deposits, work in excavations where their ancestors once performed ceremonies acknowledging the spiritual forces governing underground treasures. They know which passages lead to the richest deposits and which excavation techniques prevent dangerous collapses, but they cannot explain the origin of this knowledge or the significance of the geometric patterns their ancestors carved into chamber walls. When supervisors ask about these markings, workers suggest they might be natural rock formations. Indigenous metal workers, whose fathers learned gold-working techniques from masters, who remembered Confederation ceremonial requirements, create religious objects for cathedrals built over spaces where traditional temples once housed astronomical instruments. Their skill in working precious metals derives from ancestral knowledge, but the spiritual frameworks that once gave meaning to metalworking craftsmanship have vanished completely, leaving only technical expertise that serves alien aesthetic and religious purposes. The chalices and monstrances that indigenous artisans create for church ceremonies demonstrate technical sophistication that impresses colonial clergy. Yet they work without understanding the theological concepts that once guided Confederation metalworkers, who created golden tunjos for lake offerings. When priests commission special pieces for important festivals, these craftsmen produce objects whose excellence reflects traditional expertise, while their decorative elements follow European Christian iconography that replaced indigenous symbolic systems. Spanish merchants who control emerald exports from highland mines employ indigenous workers whose families have extracted precious stones for generations beyond memory. These miners possess knowledge about geological formations and excavation techniques that enables them to locate deposits that European methods might miss. Yet their expertise serves purely commercial purposes, divorced from the spiritual associations that once made emerald, mining a sacred activity requiring ritual preparation. Mining reports that colonial authorities submit to peninsular officials describe production levels and export revenues, without mentioning the cultural knowledge that makes such productivity possible. Correspondence with European buyers emphasizes the superior quality of highland emeralds, while attributing their excellence to favorable geological conditions, rather than the accumulated expertise of workers whose ancestors developed extraction techniques over centuries of experience. Indigenous miners who know which mountain faces contain the richest emerald veins and which excavation methods prevent tunnel collapses work for colonial masters who regard their skills as fortunate coincidence rather than inherited expertise. They cannot explain why certain areas produce higher quality stones, or why traditional timing for excavation activities coincides with seasonal patterns, since the cultural frameworks that once provided meaning for these practices disappeared before their birth. Vice-regal inspectors who visit highland territories to assess administrative efficiency find well-organized settlements whose residents speak fluent Spanish, practice Catholic devotion, and maintain productive agricultural and mining operations that contribute substantially to colonial revenues. Their reports to the Crown describe these communities as exemplary subjects whose successful integration demonstrates effective imperial administration, with no mention of the sophisticated civilizations that once flourished in these same territories. Census records that colonial inspectors review show population figures, tax assessments, and religious compliance rates for communities whose Spanish names replace indigenous designations that once reflected sacred geography and ceremonial significance. Lake Guatavita appears in these documents simply as another administrative unit, its designation preserving the ancient name while eliminating all memory of the sacred ceremonies that once made these waters central to Confederation spiritual life. Notarial records that document land transfers between colonial estates preserve certain traditional place names, while eliminating indigenous spatial concepts and territorial boundaries that once organized highland communities, according to ecological zones and ceremonial relationships. These legal documents, designed to serve European property concepts, impose foreign geographical categories upon landscapes whose natural features and human settlements developed according to organizational principles that colonial administration neither recognizes nor values. Spanish estate owners who inherit lands encompassing valleys, where Confederation ceremonies once legitimated political authority through divine sanction, possess property titles that describe boundaries using European surveying methods, ignoring the astronomical alignments and sacred geography that guided traditional territorial organization. When they travel through their domains, they observe productive agricultural land whose value derives from location and soil quality rather than spiritual significance that made these sites central to indigenous civilization. By 1750, the cultural transformation that began with Conquest achieved such complete success that highland communities whose ancestors once participated in El Dorado ceremonies display no conscious awareness of their indigenous heritage beyond vague family traditions that attribute noble status to long-dead relatives whose actual historical significance remains unclear. Parish priests who serve these communities find nothing in their behavior or beliefs to distinguish them from other peaceful agricultural populations throughout the viceroyalty. Colonial officials who submit administrative reports to peninsular authorities describe highland territories as fully integrated provinces whose economic productivity and religious orthodoxy demonstrate successful implementation of imperial policy. These documents preserve no memory of the Confederation that once commanded respect throughout highland territories, their bureaucratic language reducing complex historical developments to statistical summaries of tax collection and population management. The transformation reaches completion not through dramatic destruction, but through quiet forgetting, the final victory of imperial efficiency over indigenous memory, administrative convenience over cultural complexity. What began beside sacred lakes, where divine beings first taught highland peoples, the arts of civilization, ends in colonial offices, where bureaucrats process routine reports about peaceful communities whose productivity and compliance provide no indication of their ancestral greatness. The circle closes with silence, the last whispers of Confederation heritage fading into administrative documents that record only names and numbers, preserving nothing of the achievements that once made these mountains echo with ceremonies that connected earth to heaven. Where once the zipper emerged from Guatavita's sacred waters, transformed into golden vessel, bridging mortal and divine realms, Now only colonial tax collectors note the lake's boundaries for purposes of property assessment and revenue calculation.